Hello, everyone, and welcome to another session of Spiral Dynamics Integral Live. Today, we have with us Auke, who's going to be talking to us about values development in Europe in the context of the invasion of Ukraine. Auke has worked with Spiral Dynamics in organizations and social projects since 2005 and has been conducting certification training since 2007. And since the 80s, he's been interested in politics and the tension between autocratic and democratic forces in Europe, which is something I think we're all interested in, and I'm very particularly interested in. So I'm really looking forward to that. Also, something that happened just a couple of days ago that has affected all of us who are interested in spiral dynamics, and that's Don Beck, one of the co-authors of the spiral dynamics theory, unfortunately passed away, and Auke knew him and worked with him. And so I think we would like to start this session by honoring him in some way. So I pass the mic to you.
Okay, thanks, Veronica. Yeah, I actually like to dedicate today to Don. He passed away peacefully. His son told us he's been unwell for a while and actually out of action for a while, which I think was hugely frustrating for him. Because if I can't speak for him, but what I saw is that he felt there was still so much to do. He in the last years he was acting like an early 20-year-old who was going to conquer the world, basically, right? So. But sometimes our body limits us to do that, and I think that it's I especially like to dedicate today to Don because Don has been the first one to apply Graves' work in conflict situations, and probably the most the most active person. It hasn't been done a lot. Don had worked in South Africa, in the Middle East, and when he came to the Netherlands in the early 2000s, he was everything was about the development, how yellow would develop in the Netherlands, how we dealt with our conflict situations. And it's always been his focus. So I'd like to, in that tradition, I like today talk about the values development in Europe and the Ukraine conflict. I'm not a historian, but what I'm going to do is the information from history that I do know, and also that I'll at the end of the presentation I'll mention some historians which I think are the best people to listen to when it comes to what's happening. Obviously, history has a way of being interpreted, and if we use a spiral lens from each value system, we can interpret history differently. I'm going to do it as much as possible factually, but I'm going to mostly put it into the context of our value systems, right? To understand really what happens. Personally, I've been involved in Eastern Europe in the 80s and 90s a lot. I mean, still work with people there now. And so I'll share a little bit of my own personal experiences as well, and during the session. Okay. So the first thing that I like to say is that I'm going to go through the history of Europe, starting from the Second World War to today, and basically look at how certain powers developed, and then of course when we make a values analysis, for instance, of a country, we can only simplify it in this presentation, right? Because each of these countries, they will have people in it with all of the values. So if you look on an individual level, here I've used the 4-quadrant model from Wilber. If you look at the individual level, all these value systems are available in a country. If you look at local social situations, you'll find all the value systems there, most likely. But what I was looking at is a lot is this bottom right, the structure, the way that the society has worked and the force it's been in the dynamics that we will be talking about. Right. So, and I'm sure that I'll oversimplify things all the time with that. But the idea is to find the common threads that run through history, that run through through this development that we've seen over the last years. Okay. So let's start with the Second World War, right? It's Second World War. We saw Nazi Germany conquer most of Europe. I think what a lot of people don't realize is that the start of the Second World War was not only Hitler invading Poland and Austria, Czechoslovakia, but it was also initiated by Russia back then, who started to basically, they made a pact with Hitler. They carved up Europe, Eastern Europe, decided who would go there. And Russia attacked Poland and Finland, and Hitler attacked also Poland and various other countries, right? And so why did they do that? Well, if we look at the Nazi ideology of Hitler, it's rooted in the feeling of superiority, basically, you know. So in his case, it was the Aryan race, which he saw as the core of Germany, being a superior race. Obviously against the Jews, but also, you know, we shouldn't forget also the Romas and the Sintis and homosexuals, and there were various groups that he saw as, basically being less. There was a feeling of superiority. There was a feeling of being the victim after the First World War. I've actually, when I look online, I see still people saying that, you know, well, look, of course, you know, Hitler had to do that because they were a victim of the First World War. Obviously, those are narratives that are used and that were used by Hitler probably as well. But we have to realize that that's never the real cause, right? If you look at the real cause, it was a fertile ground, Germany, for fascism to rise, for Nazism to rise. Feeling of superiority, the idea that they needed to expand and that they were a better race, and that better race needed to basically rule Europe, and it needs to protect itself. And that's a very important thing there. It's a territorial expansion, right? So we need to make ourselves bigger. If you look at it from a Spal point of view, the superiority feeling about the race and so on is very much rooted in purple, and then the violence that's connected to that is very much rooted in red. So to me, that's a very purple-red dynamic. There's obviously Germany had a lot of, you know, there was a lot of structure in there as well. So there was a blue structure there. But as far as ideology concerned, it was much more rooted in purple and red, this superiority feeling and protecting of, you know, its own race than anything else. If you look at the other side, Russia at that time, communist ideology. You know, as far as values profile, I've put the Russian profile much more into blue, because there was this ism, communism. It was an ideology. There was a book behind it, a truth behind it. And there is also in Russia, and we'll see that when we look at it today, there within the culture, you know, there is also a little bit of this superiority idea, which has come back over the ages. But that wasn't so much what communism was based on, right? It was just an ideology, and it needed to spread, and it opposed itself towards democracy. If you look at Stalin as a leader, we probably would find much more of a red profile in him. So that's why I've also put a lot of red in there as far as values are concerned. But their idea was to spread communism. They saw democracy as a threat, so they had to conquer as much territory as possible for their own ideology, to protect it and to make it grow. So also this territorial expansion is a very important part of that ideology. And the beginning of the war, they worked together until Hitler started to attack Russia, and then of course there was a very bloody war between those two nations. Now it's good to remember that, because the Russian story of the Second World War It's called the Great Patriotic War, and it is about defending their country against the Nazism of Hitler and the West, right? Which of course partially is true, but they actually started the war before they were threatened by Hitler's Nazism, and I think that's a piece of information that's often not taken into account when people judge the situation. I'll talk a little bit more, because one of the things I also want to do in this presentation is to look at how the different parties in the West currently, or in the world, but look at this situation, because we have quite different views looking at the current crisis in Ukraine. But I'll get to that later. Good. So I'll put a little. So then the Second World War ends, and basically the Allied forces, the US, the UK, and many of the occupied countries had, like, people fleeing to the free areas. They got together and they attacked Hitler from the south and from the west, and of course Russia was fighting Hitler from the east. And at some stage they met each other in Berlin, and they ended the Nazi regime. So on the Western side, the narrative was very much, we need to free people. There was the nations were democratic. They had a sense of fighting against dictatorship. We'll talk later that they were democratic, but they weren't perfect nations, right? Let's be honest about that. But there was a sense of nationalism. So there was a strong blue. Most of these countries actually were dominant blue, but there was enough orange there to want a democratic system, to want freedom, at least for ourselves, I should say. Right? We have to realize that Eastern Europe was not freed, right? So Eastern Europe was, that's the area that Russia conquered, but they stayed there and they implemented. So part of the states that they that they freed from Nazism, they annexed part of the states, or some of them were already annexed into the Soviet Union, and others were basically Russia made sure that they got ruled by communist regimes. There was no free elections. I spent a lot of time in Poland, and the memory in Poland of the Russians coming there was not of a liberating force. It was a new occupying force with lots of force, with lots of killing and raping and so on. It was a terrible ordeal for the Polish people and for many other nations to first have the wave of Nazism and then have the wave of Stalin's communism come over. So you see in this picture here, you see when there were the first free elections in each of these countries. And you see that in the blue area that basically went to the democratic states. You see the free elections there in the 40s, and in the red area you see the free elections only in the 90s happening. Right, so we'll come to that. There's a little bit of a personal line in here. These are my parents. Actually, they were kids during the First World War, between 9 and 14, and they were actually heavily traumatized by it. My mother was in Rotterdam when it was bombed. And I grew up with the hero stories, of you could say like a solid blue under our orange freedom, So the brave people that fought the Nazis. This is one of the pictures of the books I loved as a kid. It was a dog, and they was in the World War, and they were fighting against the Nazis. The reality in Holland was much harsh. The Dutch people actually cooperated a lot, or at least didn't fight a lot against Nazism, and they actually helped Hitler exterminate the Dutch Jews in a very effective way, a lot more effective than many of the other countries. But that's the narrative we had. The bad was defeated. That's how I grew up, and of course there was still this Cold War going on. What also happened in that period is that I come from a working class background. Especially my father's family was very poor. But in these decades after the Second World War, orange really grew in the Netherlands and a lot of places in Europe. and we benefited from that. They actually managed to buy a house and so on. So we basically escaped poverty through the orange system, and that's what you see. That's what you see happening in Europe in after the Second World War. Is the more and more orange is as a dominating force, right? But when the Second World War ended, if you look at the picture on the left below, just ignore this little part here. You see these are all the colonies of European nations. This is a picture from 1945, right? So where we were very much about democracy and actually sovereignty when it came to our own countries, we had a double standard because the Dutch still owned Indonesia. The British still owned India and many other nations, right? So, but when orange grew as a value system in the people, the states were less and less possible. It was less and less possible for the states to keep these colonies. You could say that the hypocrisy of wanting our own freedom, but not allowing others to have their freedom, couldn't be maintained. And if you look at how Gandhi worked on freeing India from the British, you see that he used the media a lot. He was very, in a way, Gandhi was yellow about that. He understood the different forces. And one of the things he understood, that his biggest weapon was the media, to show the media what was going on in India and how the people were being suppressed and killed and so on. Because he knew with that way he could influence the public opinion back in England, and the government there could not maintain its colonies. So you could say there was a fight between the red, blue, and the orange in our countries. The Dutch fought a bloody war to maintain Indonesia, which they luckily lost. When I went to school as a kid, I didn't get those stories, right? I got the hero stories of the Second World War. I didn't get the stories about the war crimes, basically, of the Dutch in Indonesia. You could say orange won in a way that we had to give up these colonies, and you have to also realize that orange is about democracy, free market, and that needs stability, right? So whereas from the blue system, we still want this expansionism, we still want our territory to grow. With orange, we just want our business to grow, right? Today, the Dutch, we're a small nation. We have nothing to gain from conquering Belgium and putting it into our territory. We want free trade relations. For the Dutch organizations, it is important, companies, corporations, it's important to have free trade relationships, to have stability. The Dutch are actually dragging their feet when it comes to sanctions towards Putin at the moment, because they don't want to give up the business relationships. So it's deep orange there. So orange focuses on territorial integrity, on sovereignty. And that's an important thing to realize in this. However, for our businesses, we can make exceptions when it is not our territory, but somebody else's. So you see in the decades after the Second World War, you see some wars being fought. Some of them they're really about the ideology, but other ones are really about business interest. If a lot of what's happening, what the US is doing in the Middle East is a lot about, interest in oil and things like that. And I'm not going to go into that. I think that because that's a narrative we know a lot. I'm actually not touching so much upon this, this Cold War standoff between Russia and the US. But it's important to realize that at least for our own countries, the orange needs this stability. But you could see our colonialism in orange is done through economic dominance, right? So it's also where Western firms in Africa sort of dominate the way that the trade is done, right? Another thing that happened in Europe is that after the Second World War, there were still some dictatorships in the south of Europe, in Spain and in Portugal, and later in Greece. So throughout the decades after the Second World War, we see that those dictatorships, they fade away. Orange wins, and those countries, their orange values increase as well. The European Union is formed. Its sole purpose, first of all, is economic. It has this ambition to to be more than that. But anyway, we'll talk about that in a moment. Good. So then, if we look at the Cold War, because while that's happening, while Western Europe develops more and more orange values, there is this standoff happening, between the West and the East. That's what I think some of us grew up with. Basically, Europe was split between, you could say, orange and blue on one side, some green, and red and blue on the other side, right? Of course, there was, you can say that where orange is about democracy and freedom, individual freedom and free trade, that in itself, in this dynamic, became an ideology. So, if there was a conflict somewhere in the world, and if Russia would support one party, then the Americans and the Europeans would support the other parties. You would see that, the West would sometimes install dictatorships just to counter communism on the other side, which is actually what happened in Greece. It's not as I said, orange democracy is good for ourselves. Somewhere else, we weren't so precise about that. Important thing is NATO forms to ensure the security in Europe. And it was despite some of the conflicts that NATO has also been involved with, predominantly NATO is a defense organization. It's there to defend the integrity of this border. So where the European Union takes care of the economic side of things, NATO takes care of the security side of things. And in response to that, Russia formed the Warsaw Pact. It is important here to point out that the countries that were part of the Warsaw Pact, actually, that was not a choice of the people to do that. Let me put it that way. Right? So it was the regimes were not democratically elected, and so they were, you could say, the Soviet Union forced these countries, or the puppet regimes became part of Warsaw Pact. In that period, obviously, so when I'm looking at Eastern Europe here, and I'm showing that there is a dominant blue and red force there, which is the ideology of communism and the enforcement of it. That's what I put there in red. Obviously, on an individual level in Eastern Europe, there were also orange values developed. And there were revolutions. People tried to free themselves, a lot around students, but also, if you look at, Hungarian Revolution, but it was then suppressed by the Soviet military forces, right? The same thing happened in the Prague Spring in 68. Soviet invaded Czechoslovakia with 500,000 troops, and they suppressed the call for reforms and freedom. Solidarnosc in the 80s, it wasn't so much suppressed by Russian forces, but it was also a call for more democracy, more freedom, and it was also suppressed. Good. And as I said, this Cold War, I'm just showing it in Europe, but outside Europe, the signs of that Cold War were seen where America and Russia, they were moving against each other in many conflicts. Also, it already happened in Africa, after the Second World War, where some of the countries that tried to free themselves from colonism were then supported by Russia in their fights, and in the hope to install a communist regime once the occupation was gone. I think it's also a good point to point out that, when we talk about the Soviet Union, we may sort of think, oh yeah, that's so that was there, that's one force. But you have to realize that the Soviet Union formed after occupying not only Eastern Europe, but also many Middle Asian countries and so on, right? So it was a large area that was for a large part occupied, including Ukraine and so on, right? So Kazakhstan, all these nations, Georgia, they were all occupied by the Soviet Union. And I'm saying that because I think most of us in the last decades, we've sort of looked a lot at the downside of what our countries have been doing, the Western countries have been doing in the world, colonism and so on. And in that respect, Russia and the Soviet Union are often sort of seen as a counterforce in that. But Russia colonized just as much as other nations. It just did it with the nations on its border. It didn't do it the other side of the world. To try to influence that. But you can see this Soviet Union as basically Russia with a lot of colonies around it. I think that's a good way to look at that. Meanwhile, going back to Western Europe and the US, egalitarian values emerged. If you look in Europe, the 50s had this Cobra artist movement, which was one of the clear signs we see of green egalitarian values emerging. Of course, the hippies. Basically, imagine all the people living life in peace. You could say that sums up the whole hippie movement, the whole counter movement in Europe. European Union was formed, and it was actually also a call for peace, right? It's also there's certainly, although it's quite complex when it comes to all the values there, and it was started just because of the orange protection of the orange trade. There is also an ideology has grown in the European Union, which is a call for unity, for peace, which goes beyond just business interest. We see in Europe, we saw a rise in racism. We see a lot of immigration happening in the Netherlands, for instance. In the 80s, I was involved in an anti-discrimination committee because we saw since in the 80s, for the first time since the Second World War, we got a neo-Nazi back in our parliament, Jan Maat. He was very adamant racist, but behind him there was also a bit of a neo-Nazi ideology. If we look at today's political part, you could say we wish we'd have him back instead of some of the other positions we have now. But anyway, and then of course there was the anti-war movement, right? So in the West, we started to realize that not only with our colonies, but also in the way that the West behaved in the world, it wasn't so much about freedom. The Vietnam War, for America, but also for Europe, showed the shadow sides of our, you could say, democratic ideology. The US went in there, to fight communism, but it became a senseless war, right? The support in Central America, Nicaragua, for where we saw America support dictatorial regimes just to counter communism, and that's where in Europe there was this movement. We saw that in this Cold War, weapons were more and more weapons, including nuclear weapons, were positions on both sides. We sort of got used to that situation. Okay, Russia was there, we were here. Why have more weapons? In my memory, it's a funny situation because on one hand, there was this constant threat that Russia could invade Western Europe. But if they hadn't done that for for 20 years or 30 years, nobody was really expecting that. So there was also this, and this is really also a personal story here. I was a radical pacifist in the 80s. I thought that we should get rid of all weapons. In one hand, you could say, looking back at it, it was realistic when it came to the arms race. Why keep adding arms? If this is the level where we're at, we could maybe could bring it down a little bit. So that was a realistic part of it. The unrealistic part of it was the idea that we wouldn't need the military to protect ourselves, right? And I refused to go into the army. In the end, I didn't have to refuse because I had a medical thing that got me out. But I had the idea we didn't need our army, and that was extremely naive. And to me, that's I grew up with also with a school with a lot of egalitarian values. My mother had quite a few egalitarian values besides the underlying blue that was in our family. And we wanted to have harmony and peace and so on. Now, there was also a part of, you could say, the left-wing movement, which I was part of in the Netherlands, that started to idolize communism and Russia and Cuba and Eastern Europe. And that was where I drew the line. I knew that our democracy was very valuable. And that's probably, I think at first, that was there because of the experience my parents had had under the occupation of the Nazis in the Netherlands, right? So for me, it was clear back then already that at least Russia didn't have the freedom that we had, right? But there was, a lot of people on the left in the Netherlands or in other parts of Europe, they preferred communism above the capitalism, and you could say it was a fight against the excess of the orange system, and it wasn't only the unjust wars and so on that we were seeing there. It was also seeing the fight against the business first attitude. Everything was about business and what this individualism was growing, but it was what about the social care? You see, so in the values profile here, I put some red in there, which you could say this is radicalism, dominant green, but it didn't include any orange, right? So this was transcend orange, but it didn't include orange. One thing that strengthened my non-communist experience is that in the 80s, I started to go to Poland a lot. My mother actually was part of an aid organization that brought supplies to a hospital in Gdansk, and I managed to do an apprenticeship there. I lived in Poland for a little while. I was even married to somebody from Poland for a while, and I saw what life under communist regime looked like. The values profile that I would give Poland at that time was what you see here. So there was a strong purple. There was this idea we're in this ordeal together, right? And people were very helpful. It was quite incredible. You see how people that had very little would share everything to help each other. Of course, there were also very strong Catholic values there. 80% of Poland back then was Catholic, so that was and of course those two strengthened each other as well. The interesting thing was that while I was there, I never really met anybody that was a convinced communist. I saw that people that were part of the party system, but back then in the 80s already, and I'm sure that must have been different in the years before that, there was not also my friends, they weren't really afraid, privately at least, to speak against the regime or anything like that. Other Eastern European countries had different profiles. For instance, in Eastern Germany, people wouldn't have had so much freedom to speak freely because the Stasi, the security forces, they could be your parents basically. There was a very different, a much stronger underlying blue in that society. In Poland, that wasn't the case. And the people that were part of the system or had positions in the party, it was just about privilege. It's about, personal privilege, basically. And it was highly corrupt, So I remember one time I was in Gdansk and I needed to go to extend my visa, which would take me a whole day to go to Warsaw and be on the train and so on. And one of my friends said, "Oh, I can arrange that for you." And then the question is, what does it cost? Now, there were different, the prices would be, is it a bar of chocolate? Is it a pack of coffee? In this case, it was an expensive one. It was a bottle of cognac. Right? So I bought a bottle of cognac, and 2 days later, I got my visa. That's how the system worked. In the late 80s, a friend of mine and I, we traveled from Gdansk all the way down to Dubrovnik in Yugoslavia, and we came to the Czechoslovakian border, and we didn't have a visa. We were told we could buy it there, and we couldn't. And it was the same thing. We put some money in a passport, and back then I didn't have anybody to ask, so it was a bit uncertain to me what to do. But I think we put in 10 German marks and 10 American dollars, and this guy came back, so happy. And that's how it works. So this whole system, you could say the system suppressed. So I put a lot of blue in there, not because it was so fair, but because it was suppressed. But underneath it, there was this, society functions on this red layer underneath it, right? Highly corrupt. I had friends who were part of Solidarność, and I brought some material for them to the West. And so that was going on as well, and it had to be secret, of course. That wasn't allowed. But also, for me, that wasn't a very dangerous thing to do. Let me put it that way. As a Western person, the worst that could happen is that I got deported, and you could see that already the ideology was sort of fading. But the suppression was really high. My friends there, they all wanted to do things. I had a friend who was a bit older than me, was a surgeon, and he could do one heart surgery in a week in Poland. If he would be in a hospital in the Netherlands, he could do two a day, basically. And so a lot of my friends there tried to get away, tried to get jobs abroad, because some of my friends actually had a little business there, but it was all very hard. And you could see that orange was sort of popping up everywhere, but it was suppressed. I'm talking here from the experience I had in Poland, and I haven't been able in other countries to find, much different dynamics. Obviously, in each of these countries has its unique profile and unique sort of cultural expression. But I think you could say that in general, this was this blue communist layer was laying over Eastern Europe. Towards the end of the 80s, it was this feeling that it was all senseless. I love this Sting song, I wish the Russians loved their children too. I think that sort of sums up how we thought about that. The senselessness of this standoff between the two. And then, of course, the Soviet Union starts to crumble. Right? Gorbachev is elected in 85. He's one of the youngest, I think the youngest general secretary in Russia. He has these reform ideas. He's not against communism, but he wants to reform communism from the inside out. It's not about a revolution. He has his perestroika, glasnost. These are terms and ideas that he has. Then there's the Chernobyl disaster, which basically shows the Russian people that can't trust their state, because the information is suppressed and suppressed and suppressed until people find out the full scale of the disaster. And by then, a lot of people are affected by it that shouldn't have been affected. And there is the retreat out of Afghanistan. These are just some important events where the Russians basically can't keep up their presence. And what starts to happen in Russia is that people start to protest, and where normally the protests are suppressed, they are no longer suppressed. Sometimes a little bit, but most of them not. So you can see slowly this whole system just starts to collapse. McDonald's opens up in 1990. Then there is this movement, so slowly the reformists start to win terrain. August 91, there is a coup, a military coup to try to get things back to the old Soviet system. But that coup sort of fails after a few days. And then Yeltsin emerges as he wants democracy. And so if you look at it in terms of value systems, what you see happening here is that the blue layer just collapses. Right? The ideology collapses, but the red layer underneath it, you could say the KGB being a red force underneath it, that's still there, right? There is no external party that comes in like in Germany that stops the regime and installs a new regime. There's also there's no cleaning of the regime, you could say. It collapses. The ideology collapses, but then we have this situation, and here we are with red and orange comes up. Of course, this suppressed orange that was there in Eastern Europe was also there in Russia. That comes up as well. But the blue layer starts to miss. I had in 91, I was in Moscow, and I met this guy who was run his own business, and we went to a restaurant, and we were sitting there, and then these two guys came that looked not very friendly, and then we were kicked out of the restaurant. We were in this alley, and what I realized then is that my friend that I met there, he had this business, and these two gruesome guys, they were basically the mafia. And to me, that was a sort of typical. I had more of those experiences at that time, but one of those typical experiences of the red and the orange emerging in Russia, and the lack of blue to help my friend run his business in an orange manner, you could say. We were also robbed on the street or tried to be robbed on the street and so on. And it was like the blue layer was missing there. Right? And then, of course, the Berlin Wall fell. Now, I don't know how many of you would, know exactly what that was. I think most of them have an idea, but you have to realize, this wall was built in, I think, the early 60s, and 171 people were shot dead. Trying to get, the wall was there to keep people in, not to keep people out. So the Iron Curtain was there, not to keep Western people from going into Eastern Europe, but to keep Eastern Europeans to go to the West. And it was built by the Soviet Union, of course. As the Soviet Union was collapsing, all these the resistance in these individual countries in Eastern Europe started to get space, get auctioned, you could say. There was this Hungarian pan-European picnic, which was organized basically to try and create some freedom, which happened. And then in the DDR, it was actually a funny sort of series of events where accidentally the Berlin Wall was opened. You could say it was an administrative unclarity. And then somebody on television said, oh yeah, you don't need a pass to travel to the West anymore. And then people started to directly queue up at the border gates, and the border guards were there. Yeah, oh well, they were told that the party said on television we can let people go out, and then people could freely come to the West. And all of a sudden the whole thing was over. It was quite you could say it was an anticlimax. And again, it's this blue layer was collapsing, right? And it opened. If you look at these are actually photos that I made. New Year's Eve, 1989. New Year's Eve, I spent in Berlin with a friend, and these were photos. We were, celebrating on the Berlin Wall, which was, we could just freely walk to East Berlin and so on. It was, and to me, after all these years in Poland and seeing my friends having all these difficulties coming to the West, it was a euphoric moment. And it sort of opened this anything is possible 90s for us. All of a sudden this Cold War was gone. The idea was the good prevailed. Of course, that was a simplification of events, but Europe was a different place. Now in Russia, after that period, as I said, the blue collapsed and it never really came back. Yeltsin was elected, and it was actually a democratic election. At first, in the 90s, you see an increase in prosperity in Russia, but then all of a sudden, but then that sort of stops, and Russia becomes a chaos. And as I said, there was no cleansing. So these KGB forces were there. The properties, everything was property of the state. But who was gonna own it now? And people were giving people with the right connections. Let me say, so it was good to be in politics, because when you're in politics, you had access to these state-controlled resources, and you could hand them out to yourself and friends. And that's what happened, right? So, and then in the end of the 90s, Yeltsin wasn't well. He was under threat from other forces. There was going to be an election. Yeltsin was behind in the polls, and he was afraid to lose his position. And what he was most afraid of is that if the other forces, there were like communist parties and so on, if they became back in power, that he and his family would be punished and jailed and maybe killed or whatever. So it was to defend themselves, they found Putin to replace Yeltsin, who wasn't well enough. But it was basically a chaotic period, and so the red line through it is that Yeltsin installed Putin as his replacement, which wasn't a democratic process. But there's still these elections coming up, right? So what they needed is a way to ensure that if the elections came, Putin would be elected. Now, the official story is that Chechen people started to bomb apartment buildings in Russia. I've looked into it as much as I can, which doesn't mean that I studied it for weeks, but everything that you find about it points to the fact that it's very likely that Putin created these, actually was responsible for these bombings to create more chaos. Because what does chaos need? It needs a strong leader. And you have to remember that if you look at the population of Russia at that time, it was centered around purple-red values, right? There wasn't, of course, orange was there, all these values were there, but the majority of the population in Russia, they had been in this communist system. And remember how life conditions create value systems, right? So, of course, within the Soviet Union, people can grow into orange and green values, but as a society as a whole, you will stay with the values that are there, which are purple, red, and blue. So when Putin used some strong language that he would fight the Chechens, and he started a war in Chechnya, a very brutal war to suppress these so-called terrorists, that gave him the image of the strong guy that would control the chaos. And that's how he basically got into power, right? So if you see that, he actually, in the beginning of the 2000s, he did bring stability, not in Chechnya, but in Russia, right? And that, of course, after the chaos, created also economic growth. There was some order there. It's really hard to value profile people, right? And we can only do it from their actions, and it's difficult to do it on a distance. But I think if you would have looked at Putin there would have been some orange values there. He understood that, trading with the West is a profitable thing. The other thing is, he comes from a very humble background, right? So, and he's now one of the richest men in the world. So, and that wasn't gained through orange values. That was gained through a lot of taking away the state companies from the Soviet Union, putting them into private ownership and so on. And Putin is actually very careful to hide his real wealth, but it's very clear that that wealth wasn't gained through the red value, through the orange value system, was gained through the red value system. Grab as much as I can, basically. Right. But then, over the last 2 decades, he slightly started. He bought the media or gained control of the media. He actually controls the oligarchs, because he made very clear during his reign that that he could give away these state companies to people, but he could also take them back if they didn't do what they wanted. And, some of the oligarchs, they got jailed, they got killed, they got poisoned, whatever it was. So these oligarchs are actually very careful in dealing with Putin. And the same thing happens, of course, for anybody that wants to oppose him politically. Throughout the last 2 decades, he basically has made clear that he doesn't want anybody to oppose him. And, he either, like Navalny, for instance, who was poisoned and now is jailed, and others were killed and so on. So, and obviously a lot of these things, there is very little direct proof for. If you study all of them, and if you also listen to the people that have really dug into the archives to find the information and so on, there are so many indications that this is Putin's doing, basically, right? So, and he also, what also happened in the last 2 decades, Putin grew up, he was a KGB agent, right? He was actually a low-level KGB agent. He didn't do any exciting spying thing. He was just a bureaucrat somewhere in Eastern Germany. And if you look at his sort of personal history, he was a street fighter. He was always getting into fist fights with people in school and so on. And he had this hatred against Western democracy. And that is, I think, a red line that goes through his whole life. And he started to create this narrative that democracy in the West were deplorable. And of course, within Russia, after the experience of the chaos of the 90s, which were the closest Russia ever came to democracy, you can understand that that narrative has a fertile ground. The other thing you have to realize is that while in the last decades, most Russians had access to internet and could see everything that we could see, quite a portion of the Russians didn't do that. They just looked at the state television news, and that was controlled by Putin. And right now, that's the only news they get, because they try to limit internet as much as possible, and Facebook and so on, right? So there is a large portion of Russia that basically follows the version of history and the version of the world that Putin presents them. And it's a picture in which, how to say that, Putin, there's a lot wrong with the West, and he uses that. But it's, you can take a fact and you can take a few facts, and you can make 2 very different narratives about why it's happening. So you would take Assange. I think Assange should be freed. I don't think he should be in jail. Putin uses this to prove that the West's our jails are full of political prisoners, and that's just simply not the case. Right? So you have to realize that the story that the Russians get is very, very narrow. And of course, every history can be interpreted in different ways. But I would say some interpretations are much further away from the factual reality than others are. On the same time, on the Western side of things, EU and the NATO expand, right? The Eastern Europe, what happens in Eastern Europe while Russia is going through this development, Eastern Europe actually develops democracies. You could say they develop enough of a blue layer to install an orange democracy. It's not perfect. If you look at Poland, it's almost autocratic. If you look at Hungary, I would dare say it is autocratic. It's not perfect. If you try to judge, these democracies by Northwestern European standards, there's a lot to say about that. And also, while in the West these green values emerge, they're not necessarily so strongly there in Eastern Europe. Remember that where our democracies are 100 or more years old, these democracies are there only for a couple of decades. So we have to compare them. If you compare it to the Netherlands, you have to compare it to the Netherlands in the 19th century, not with the Netherlands today. Right? But EU and NATO expansion, a little bit about NATO expansion, because this is this big thing, we hear about, they promised the Russians not to expand NATO. Well, here's the thing. Yes, when they were talking, you have to realize the Soviet Union collapsed. So there was no treaty anywhere about that, except about Eastern Germany. Russians had nuclear weapons there, had an army. They had, I think, like 380,000 or 500,000 people there in the army. So there was this time where this whole thing collapsed, and the Germans said, we want unification. And they had to negotiate with Russia by then, or the Soviet Union, but Russia, about the retreat of Russian troops. And they had to make a deal about that. And in that deal, there was talk about let's not expand NATO. But it was said by the American foreign minister, but it wasn't shared by Bush back then. It wasn't shared by others. The Germans made some remarks about it. But in the end, there was a treaty there that didn't promise anything. So there was never on paper any agreement about no NATO expansion. I think that's a really important thing to realize. The other thing to realize is that Eastern European people, and I'm sure Rasa can say this better than I can, but people in Eastern Europe, they knew after 45 years of Russian occupation, never again. We don't want this again. So what's the first priority was free elections and NATO membership, and of course EU membership for the economic part of things. NATO expansion has always been a democratic process. Nobody is ever forced to join NATO. I think that's an important thing to realize. The other thing to realize is that obviously in the background of this, there was always American foreign policy playing. And obviously America has a very big influence on NATO, but it's not all. If I listen to the American media in this, they sort of make it look like it's the decision of the US whether NATO would expand or not. Now they can block it. But if you look at today, Sweden and Finland want to join in NATO, and who wants to use their veto? It's Turkey, right? So it's a joint decision of everybody for every country to extend with NATO. And obviously there is a underlying geopolitical agenda for the US, and not sure saying that the US foreign policy is such a humanitarian, fantastic thing. But it's really good to realize that this was a call for freedom from Eastern Europe to join. In the meantime, in Europe, we were sort of focused on how to incorporate Eastern Europe, which had more blue values, with, like how do we deal with Orban with his more autocratic values, Poland and so on. And while that was going on, the real threat was actually in the background. Europe's been extremely naive in the last decades. Because we've become fully reliant on gas from Russia. And we had this idea that, look, this democracy is it's the best thing that you can ever imagine. So everybody wants that, right? So as long as we have economic ties with the country, they won't attack us. So as long as we have good economic ties with Russia, we're safe, and we can use diplomacy and everything like that. I think the pinnacle of naivety in Europe must be Schroeder, used to be Prime Minister of Bundeskanzler of Germany, who was actually a close friend of Putin and made sure that the Nord Stream line was there, and he's actually worked for Nord Stream and so on. Right. Then there was this talk about Ukraine and Georgia joining the NATO, and Russia said we don't want that, and there was this big thing, and then Russia violently attacked Georgia. Now that should have been a huge red flag for all of Europe, saying, oh, listen, what's going on here? But we just kept, you could say business as usual, a few sanctions, a deal talks. We actually didn't do anything about that, because Georgia was attacked to make sure that Georgia and Ukraine should not be part of NATO. And then there's these talks have been going on about Ukraine, but Europe as a whole, and I think that's where you see also a lack in common foreign policy. We've not made a clear stance, yes or no. That and we sort of left Ukraine in a very vulnerable position by not taking a clear position about it, because everything is about politics, and still the response in Europe is very much about that. And then in 2014, Russia invades Ukraine. They annex Crimea, and then they invade you could say they start a resurrection in eastern Ukraine, but it basically is an invasion. And it is a response. We'll talk a little bit later about that too, what happened in Ukraine. And what you see is that Europe is at that time already, Putin's red values are becoming more and more dominant. And we try to fight that with economic sanctions and with diplomacy. Of course, it's good to realize that in the West, we have these challenges. We have climate change. This business imperialism is, to many of us, becoming more and more clear. Human rights are more important at home than abroad. And you could say it still is often in our countries, right? And in response to that, in Western Europe, but also in the US, you see a rise in populism. So you could say the cracks in the orange system are responded by, purple, red, and some blue. They respond to that. They don't like the dominance of orange and green. They don't like these libertarian values. They actually want to go back to a more autocratic regime. The themes are used, a lot of immigration and so on. But it's basically a values conflict that we have. The orange and green against the more traditional thinking people that don't feel that they are represented in our countries properly, right? On the other side of the scale, you see that within the green community, and I'm sure that most of us have experience with that, you say the hippies from the 60s and the 70s, in the 90s and the 2000s, they become the new age, the wellness, the spiritual growth scene. I think our spiral dynamics scene has a lot of overlap with that. Integral scene, certainly. Internet is, of course, available now. We get access to lots of information. We learn a lot of facts. We learn a lot of. It becomes clearer to us, how bad the West is doing in terms of climate change and social inequality and so on. But it's also a place for brewing misinformation, right? So on the internet, anybody can bring a new ideology, and with the way that social media works, we can easily convince. We can go into a mass psychosis, basically. And we see that, especially in this wellness scene, we see a lot of anti-authoritarian attitudes, and it rejects all of orange, and it translates itself often into conspiracy theories. Taking parts of what's wrong with the orange system, but making a whole story about it, about a secret cabal in the world against that. We could have a whole session just about that. I think a lot of people mistake the force of value systems for being a group of people doing it. The orange system has has faults, and as a force in itself, it creates a certain culture with the haves and the have-nots. And the haves and the have-nots, they're both, you could say, victim of that culture. So Bill Gates is not, Bill Gates is not the personification of unhealthy orange. Bill Gates is just as much part of unhealthy orange as you and I are when we use his software, Microsoft, because it's the cheapest thing to use, or when we order on Amazon or order the cheapest flight. Because in orange, it's all about business, and it's not just the billions of them, but it's also our wallet, our money, and our comfort, basically. We want to fly to, from the Netherlands to Spain for 50 euros, to have a holiday there. And then we cooperate just as much into that. But that's not, I think, what's seen so much from this mean part of green. It's not whole of green, by the way, just a part of it. And it also becomes very open to, you could say, Putin's alternative story of the Western reality. So we see that the West has all these problems. And then there's a guy there who also sees that all the West has all these problems. And then we say, well, he must be right. Right. But in that link that we make from that position, we fail to see the real nature of what's happening in Russia. So the question is, could it be, right, to this green mean part of us, I would say, could it be that the West is bad, but Russia is bad as well? And I still prefer, because the thing is that when we go on the internet and we complain about the West, we can do that from the comfort of our orange world. We are free to talk about it. We have the free time because we benefit from the economic, even if we're not rich, we benefit from economic growth that the West has gone through in the orange system. We still go to our yoga retreats in India for a low price, right? So we all benefit from that layer, despite the fact that there is a rotten part in that orange layer as well. And and then you see this marriage between red and green, right? So these two forces against the unhealthy part of the orange Western society, they join into anti-authoritarianism and being open for Putin's propaganda and so on. Given the time, I want to skip quickly over this. So now Ukraine, right? First of all, it's good to know the history of Ukraine. I've got some historians that have nice video. I'll point you to historians that have nice video talks about that. Lots of books around that. Basically, Ukraine is a very old nation, older than Russia is. Kiev was there long before Moscow was there. It has a long history of fighting for independence and identity. And it's been there, and like in all these European countries, some of them disappeared, then they came back. European history is a mess of war. And Ukraine, being in the center of Europe, was in the middle of that. So it's come and gone over the centuries. Under the Soviet Union, it became part of Russia, of Soviet Union, but it actually became an independent state, which is something that Putin now calls a mistake of Stalin. Can you imagine that you call Stalin, one of the most aggressive leaders we've had in Europe as being too soft for allowing Ukraine to actually exist? But it was there. They have an own language. They have a long history. Ukraine is definitely its own entity. Stalin actually made Ukraine a republic within the Soviet Union, but he also, when they didn't like his collective idea of farming, he committed genocide. Basically, he created artificial famines, and almost 4 million Ukrainians died in that. And it's really good to remember that that's part of the collective history of Ukraine as well, right? People talk about Nazis in Ukraine. If you look at Ukraine today, you compare it to other European nations, there's not more Nazis. There are actually less Nazis in their parliament than there are in the Netherlands. In the Second World War, in order to fight independence from Russia, part of Ukraine actually sided with Hitler, and they also helped with the genocide of the Jews. So there's a part of history there. But as I already said, the Netherlands, the Dutch people helped as well. So that's not That doesn't reflect on the whole country, but that's part of their history. And that's one of the things that Putin uses. They voted for independence. 92% of them wanted that in 92. And they were actually the third nuclear power in the world, because a lot of Soviet Union nuclear weapons were stationed in Ukraine. And they gave that up with a promise that, and it was actually a treaty, that ensured their sovereignty, their state integrity. So both US and Russia said, if you give up your nuclear weapons, we ensure that you will never be attacked. And in the 90s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, so they went a similar route as Russia, but they managed to install more blue in that. So they actually managed, and I think the other thing is that the culture in Ukraine is quite different from Russia, where Russia has a complacency when it comes to dictatorial powers. But it's almost in their DNA to sort of have this Tsar there. They've had it for hundreds of years, and they actually disengage a little bit from politics. But in Ukraine, it's different. In Ukraine, they have this thing, they don't want to be dominated by a dictator. And they make that very clear. So in 2004, there was a revolution against a leader that was showing signs of dictatorship. And in 2014, again, there was a leader who sided with Russia. They didn't want that. And there was a revolution, and there's a lot of misinformation around that. People make it look like it was a revolution that was initiated by the US. I'm sure the US supported it as Eastern European did, because it was about a trade agreement with Western Europe. But it was actually the Ukrainian people themselves who stopped the dictatorial power there. Not everybody agreed with that, because they had a pro-Russian president, and part of the Ukrainians are actually pro-Russian. But the majority of people didn't, they wanted trade relationship with the West, and they basically kicked out a president that didn't listen to the people, and they had democratic elections. Ukraine is not a perfect democracy. You have to realize that. If you judge it by Dutch or German or old democratic values, US, it's not a perfect democracy. But there is a clear orange will amongst the people to be free, you could say. There's a lot to say about Ukraine, and I urge you to look at some of the links that I'll give you. And then, of course, we have the invasion of Russia into Ukraine. But we have to, of course, realize that already started in 2014, right? We see that there is oh yeah, sorry, I forgot to say. So if you look at the values profile of Ukraine, we see all these forces in there. There's strong purple, the strong red, the strong blue, but there definitely is a strong portion of orange. It will have less orange than most of our Western democracy nations, but it's there, right? If you start to judge Ukraine by green egalitarian values, you'll find lots of things wrong with it. The way that people with color were treated when they were fleeing and so on. And I don't want to excuse that, but I want you to look at that through, how would that have been in Europe 100 years ago? Our democracies were in a similar state as 100 years ago as Ukraine is today, just because democracy needs time to incubate, basically. So Russia invades. It's a full invasion in this year. And the interesting thing is that Putin thinks that he will actually have very little resistance. He thinks he can sort of take Ukraine like he could take Crimea. And with the invasion of Ukraine, the way that this war has been waged, Putin doesn't only find, you could say, the more orange-driven Ukrainian-speaking people against him, but the minority in Ukraine, which is Russian-speaking, they now also turn against Putin. Right? So that's an important thing to realize. Another thing to realize is that one of the things that the Soviet Union did is they basically stimulated Russians to migrate to their colonies, you could say. Right? So the fact that there's a lot of Russian-speaking people in Ukraine is because of the occupation of Ukraine for a long time by Russia. right? It's not because Ukraine is half Russian or half Ukrainian. Yeah. So he invaded. And if you look at the narrative that Putin uses, he says NATO should not have expanded. Ukraine is not a real nation, which you can listen to the historians telling you how that's different. And then he says Ukrainians are Nazis, and then what happens in our green little world where people think that, the West is bad, so the East must be good, we start to look for signs of Nazism. And then there are some stories on the internet that show you that there are Nazi groups in Ukraine, right? Of course there are, because there are in almost every country in Europe at the moment, right? The fact they're a bit more militant there than there are in the Netherlands, but in the Netherlands we have more, Nazi votes in parliament than they had in the last election in Ukraine. The AfD in Germany is very much similar to it's like a neo-Nazi party. They're bigger in Germany than in the Ukrainian parliament. Right? That's really good to realize that. So and the other thing to realize is that after the Second World War, Russia has had this tradition of calling enemies Nazis. So anybody that doesn't agree with Russia, it's a Nazi. And then, so what happened to Putin? When he came to power, he probably could have gone sort of the orange way. And I'm sure the West could have done different things about that as well. Not sure they could have prevented it. But you can see that, he wasn't so welcome so much as he had hoped. And I think in the last years, he has more and more become quite extreme in the way he looked at things. And one of the inspirations of him is Ivan Ilyin. And Ivan Ilyin was a fascist philosopher who had to flee Russia in the 1930s because he was against communism, and he was fascinated by Mussolini's fascism, and later he excused Hitler for doing what he was doing. But what he did is he developed the Russian version of fascism, you could say. So he created this whole story, and the really interesting part about that is that one of the things that he talks about is that the world is a chaos. It's a dangerous place, and Russia, as a superior people, they need to protect themselves in that. Now, if I would want to describe the red values as Graves defined them, that's very much the worldview. Yeah, red sees the world as a jungle, right? And so that's really important to understand that part of Putin's narrative, right? The other thing is that Ilyin says democracy is a ritual, right? So there's not real, and that's also what Putin says about the West. They don't have real democracy. That's just a ritual they do. They don't realize, like, from that worldview, you don't see that it actually does, whatever is wrong with our, in our democracies, we have money and politics way too much connected. And not every country is a perfect democracy. And especially, I think the US and UK, through the electoral system, they're not perfect democracies. But still, there's a possibility for one party to win or the other party to win. And we can say a lot, about who gets presidents and how they have to be in bed with but we have influence on and Russia says, the West, they don't have any influence at all. Some of us in the West will agree with that. But I think that is a black and white story of the reality. Right? And the other thing is that he says the factual reality doesn't exist. And that opens up the possibility to create a whole alternative reality. That's exactly what Putin is doing. He's saying, well, history was different. Ukraine has no right to exist, and he creates a very different story. So, I've had a question last week from somebody who said, can't we have any sympathy, with Russia? Aren't they right too? And I would say from the red perspective, they're right. From that red worldview, they're right. Right? But that doesn't mean that because the consequence is that Putin says we need this sphere of influence. We need Russia needs to be a greater Russia. and he translated it into a fascist ideology. And you could argue that Russia shows signs of fascism now, because they're the victim and they need to conquer other territories to secure themselves. And really importantly in this context is that the Ukrainians are Nazis. They need to be exterminated. And Putin actually starts to talk about his enemies as being, these are some actually lines from his speech in March 15. We will spit out traitors like insects on the pavement. So it is, and that's also a sign of fascism. And I'm not saying they're fully fascist state, but they show signs of fascism because what he's cleaning inside, but also outside. So Ukraine needs to be cleaned of Nazis, but also Russia needs to be cleaned of traitors. And he's actually taken a term from that was first written in Hitler's Mein Kampf, national traitor, a national traitor or Nationalverräter in German, and he uses that. He used that in his speech, and that's just a few lines of text. And if you're really interested in looking into that, I invite you to listen more to his speeches and also to look into Ivani Ilyin, because you see all these signs there, and it's not about, he's not. I don't think Putin will, if he would manage to conquer Ukraine, he would kill all Ukrainians, but he will kill enough people to make everybody afraid, and he will go for the. And you say, are you doing that in the occupied territories? Going for the intelligentsia, the journalists, the mayors of the towns. From a red world, if you look at the world the way Russia does, then of course you're right to do what you're doing. The thing is that we as the world cannot, if we allow that, we basically will sacrifice people like the Ukrainians because we want to give space to Russia. And that's not something that I think we should do. And I think the other thing is, I think Putin is starting to show signs of arrested red, because the interesting thing with all this is, if you look at the result of his actions, right, they are contrary to what he wants. The European Union has united. NATO was not very strong, and they're talking about expansion now. I see a lack of action in the European Union, but there's a lot of unity as far as we have to stop Russia. The way we do that is a different thing. Ukrainians, as a response, have shown an incredible identity. If you say, well, Ukrainian doesn't exist, and maybe some people could have still been convinced early February of that. But if you look at what's happening in Ukraine and how united even the Russian-speaking and the Ukrainian-speaking people are in stopping this war and kicking Putin out and not giving up their country, you can see how extremely strong their national identity is. Right? And the other thing that Putin has created is a show of weakness. We actually thought the Russian army was a lot stronger than it was. Now, I'm not saying that Ukrainians will win. I think I'm not a military expert, so I can't really say on that. But from what I read, Russia has stamina. And also within Russia, Putin doesn't really care about the soldiers dying there. It's not in his view of he denies that soldiers are dying there, and so for him, where we, and that's from a democratic point of view, if we want to fight a war, we care a lot more about our young men dying in that war or our leaders care more about that than the leaders from a red nation. I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm not saying that all leaders in the West do that. But you have to realize there's an inequality there. Right? But don't underestimate Russia, because they still have nuclear weapons and so on. But you can see, and this is an interesting thing, because we had this argument once on one of the Facebook groups, is, Putin, does he have orange values? Well, if he would have had orange values, first of all, he would have thought a lot more strategic. And the other thing is that he would not have gone against his own business interest, because this is greatly hurting his and Russia's and so on economic interests. And the other sign of classic red is that that Putin seems to have surrounded himself with yes men. People didn't dare to tell him the truth about what they would expect after an invasion in Russia, because I'm sure some of the military experts and intelligence people would have maybe not predicted quite a scale of things, but would have predicted resistance. So if we now look at this fight between Russia and Ukraine, we see we see this values dynamic, right? Obviously, both sides, there's an army, there's red values on both sides, and I'm not talking about the whole society, I'm just talking about what we see in this conflict. We see an authoritarian army with very hierarchical lines where the generals are killed on the battlefield because the local units cannot make decisions by themselves. They need the generals there. So generals need to be close there. Whereas in Ukraine, I talked to somebody that knows a bit about military training and Ukraine, and he said they've actually been trained in a network way of fighting war, which is much more European. So that's why I dare to put a little yellow there. I'm not saying there's so much yellow there, but you can see they're flexible, they're highly motivated, they're very defiant, but also they are very smart in the way they fight this war. Right? And that's where you see this conflict in values. And of course, in Russia, clearly some of Russian soldiers are motivated. Other Russian soldiers are not, have a very low motivation. And the interesting thing is that even if Russia conquers the whole of Ukraine, it's very unlikely they can hold on to that. This idea of incorporated into Russia, that it shouldn't exist, it is impossible to imagine that would ever happen. Right? So my last slide. So where do we find ourselves in Europe now? Right. First of all, we've more united than we were a few months ago. Right? But not about the interventions in Ukraine. We can still see that the orange values prevail. The Dutch could do more to block Putin's money. The Germans could do more in not using the gas, also the Dutch. There is one thing, though, it is that we all of a sudden realize that not just our economic orange values, but also our freedom orange values are back on the table. And we realize that this idea that, with business relationships, we can maintain our sovereignty, it's simply not true. So this is why people are saying that we have a different world today than we had a few months ago, because now we know that we will always have to be ready to defend orange values against red dictatorship. Red simply, and some blue, looks different at the world. And there's another thing to say about that, and is that I think in the Soviet Union was less of a threat because it had that more blue layer in it. So the decision wasn't made by one person. The party had a much broader power base. But today, Putin seems to be, has an incredible amount of power, which makes the country vulnerable for the mistakes that he's making right now. This is the worst thing he could have done for Russia, is starting this war, basically. But so as the West, we have to learn that we can't put economic value before human interest. So we ignored all these things that were happening in Russia. But we would have said, we should have probably have limited ourselves much more in how much business do we want to do with a dictatorship. In the West, we have to move beyond our orange business first thinking to include all these value systems and to say, well, we can do business when this basis is there, basically. And Putin is still treated with velvet gloves. I'm not a military strategist, and I'm very happy I don't have to make this decision. But I'll just give you my, from spiral dynamics point of view, I'll give you my gut feeling, and that is that every time we say, well, let's not do that because we don't want Putin to be triggered, we strengthen Putin, and he sees that as a weakness. And that's one of the lessons here, is that, if we understand that Putin is driven from red values, the honorable thing to do is to respond to him with force, not from red values, but from a yellow perspective, saying, listen, you can't do that. And I don't know exactly what it would look like, a no-fly zone, bigger weapons, or even, real military involvement in Ukraine, making Ukraine part of NATO. But that's the sort of language. So if you have somebody driven so much from a red value and it's arrested, the only thing you can do to stop them is to use the same thing they do, and that is force. There's no other thing. Talk doesn't work. You can see economic sanctions. He knew they were coming. He didn't care about that. And although I think it's a good thing that we do that, I don't think it's enough. And this is a big lesson for the West, because if we, and the other thing that as the West we need to look at is our own immorality. So how do we deal with other nations? How moral are we about human rights when it comes to other countries? And that's and that will scatter our way of life. I realize that, but that's really the consequence of what's happening in Europe. Because if Putin wins, he will see that as a motivation to start looking at the next country, basically.
Well, I thought that presentation was incredible. And I think this, for me, demonstrates the power of spiral dynamics. It's so useful for detecting patterns and geopolitical realities, current and historical. And I've been sort of feeling and sensing many of the things that you mentioned, but I just love the way you synthesized everything. And I loved your graphics and just your general observations. So thank you so much for that. Safir has a question, and I guess we're going to go into the question answer period, or comment if you have a comment. So Safir, go ahead.
Hello, Auke. How are you?
Hi, good. How are you, Safir? Good to see you here.
Thank you. Good to see you too. First of all, I think your representation is great, and it's also very brave, because it's really flexible and going to the truth, even if it's painful. And maybe your conclusion is, is hard for people like us, which have a lot of green in them, to understand that power is what we need to act. So I think it's brave. I just want to argue or to consider about Putin and Russia motivation, because at the beginning of the war, I did some research myself, and I started the research with looking about similar things like that. And it seems to me, of course, Putin have a lot of red. This is definitely a red act, but I got to a different layer when I go deeper, which is strong blue. And I will explain. First of all, I really like Don Beck. Many times I heard him say that if you want to see the true motivations, the true color of the motivation, you have to find what this person or this culture is afraid of. What is their fears? And when there was no power, there was no power danger on Russia at this time, but NATO and Ukraine receiving more and more democracy, more and more orange value, was a risk to Putin from his value system, or he was afraid about the truth parallel to his fear from losing power. And why I'm saying this, maybe I will share. I took some of sentences. I did this research in Hebrew, and I did a screenshot of Putin's speech before the war.
You can go ahead and share now. I had turned off the share screen when we made sharing.
So this is really, of course, I listened to a few speeches, a few hours, and this is what summarized for me. another layer of Putin, which I didn't know, and I started to research. So he said, probably speaking, the attempt to use us in their own interest never ceased until quite recently. They sought to destroy our traditional values. And for us, there are false values that would erode us, our people from within. The attitudes have been aggressively imposing on their countries. Attitudes that are directly leading to the degeneration and degenerate. I forgive my English, because they are contrary to human nature. And then I start to speak to some Russian people about his past. He is a Christian. He have a lot of Christian values. And he's really fighting. And it's not only him, it's the whole culture around him. They're fighting against gay culture, against free speech, against a lot of value that they think are destroying the society, at least they say. So I find a lot of blue fear that by being a free country or being near to a free country like Ukraine will make the value of the society collapse. So I'm only asking because I really don't know if we should treat him completely red, that you cannot talk to him only by power, or maybe if you give him safety, because blues many times when they receive safety, they are when they feel that they can live their own truth, then something is relaxed.
No.
So
okay, shall I respond to that with what I see there?
Go ahead, respond.
So the first thing is that when Putin talks about traditional values a lot, right? And the thing is that he, so it shows that he has conservative values, and he sees Western democracy as a Western culture. He cannot distinguish democracy from culture, because if he would look at history, he would see that the traditional values that are there in Russia were in the Netherlands 500 years ago, you know, and in France and in UK and so on. So and if you look at a country like Japan, you know, they have a tradition and they have got democratic values and they have not lost nothing of their Japanese identity, you know. But he connects so if we go, and of course if McDonald's comes along, it can kill some of the local restaurants. And there is certainly that, you know, the Western corporations can certainly kill some of the culture. I've seen that happen in Asia, but they can't take it away, you know. So that's one, and those traditional values to me are a lot more rooted in purple than they are in blue for Putin, because it's about the identity of their race. It's also, you know, so what makes Putin more purple rather than blue? Because it's about, you know, blue is not so much about saying that your race is better than others, but that's what he does. So his ideology is very strongly in this purple red, and he uses religion, but it's not his great aim, because one thing he does, he splits the Orthodox Russian Church into two, into the pro-Putin and the anti-Putin part, right? So he uses it for his power, and everything he does. And the reason why he's afraid of democracy is because democracy will kick him off his throne. You know, it's not NATO he's afraid of. It's, as you said, it's democracy, right? That it's coming close to his doorstep. Another reason why I don't think so that he is so blue is because all the laws that he puts in place are there for his power. They're not there to create, you know. So there's no justice system other than but you know, the blue would create a very clear wrong and right and justice for everybody. Not necessarily democratic and human, you know, but it's there, and it's not in Russia. As you know, Anatoly is our friend in Moscow. What he says is, you know, the blue is a fake layer. in Russia at the moment. It's all in the interest of Putin. That's why I've put it there. And the fact that he is a complex profile, will have some blue values, I don't doubt that. And the other thing you have to realize when you listen to Putin is that from his perspective, he uses all these Western terms, but gives them a totally different meaning. So he'll talk about democracy. And in one speech, for the European leaders, he says, look, you guys are not democratic because you don't include me in your decision-making process. Which is an interesting interpretation, right? But he doesn't take that into Russia, you know. So it's not, he's not talking about democracy in Russia and the fact that there are in fact fake elections, or like this ritual he's talking about is actually what he's doing, but he doesn't distinguish between that and the so you have to be careful to look at what sort of terms he uses and how because he uses them differently than we do, and that's the interesting thing with value system. It's also when Alexander Dugin is a Russian philosopher who also has a pretty fascist ideas. And he uses all these Western terminologies, but it gives him a totally different content from his worldview. Right?
Yes, I read him. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I thought about this philosopher Ilya. You mentioned him, and and he's talking about the new country concept or the new nationality concept.
Yeah.
So I thought this is kind of bluish, but maybe it's just from their point of view, just a way to do disinformation of what they really wants.
Yeah, but it's also a lot about Russian race, Russian people, you know, and it doesn't implement it. Fascism really has more of a purple-red root than a blue root, although it contains a lot of the blue themes. It is quite a different beast, I think. Yeah. Thanks, Sophia. Barbara, please. Good to see you online, Barbara. We've seen each other on Facebook a number of times, but
yeah, good to speak to you directly. You know, one thought I have about blue is there's a stability driver there that we sometimes seem to ignore, right? And so I don't want my country to be invaded by 1 million refugees, right? Oh my God, we're racist. Well, the other blue take on that would be, you know, we just want some stability. And I think in the US, what's happening with tech is really causing a lot of problems there. You know, you have to get a new TV, you have to get a new cell phone every other year because the others suddenly stop working. And all of those sorts of just unstable drive you nuts situations for a lot of normal people centered in blue. It's not, you know, nobody cares who the invaders are. We just want a stable civilization, things not to change every 6 weeks. You know, and I think maybe we miss that sometimes about blue.
Yeah, I totally agree that it brings that. But yeah, I also have to realize that red dictatorship also brings that blue layer. It's like, you know, like Saddam Hussein in Iraq created a lot of order, but it's a thin layer of blue. It's a very different blue than, you know, Putin's blue is very different from the Soviet Union, where there was a whole system. There was not one leader that was so powerful. It's quite a more advanced, you could say, a more advanced version.
I think Putin's going back to the historical blue-red relationship of kings and nobles, right? Where you know, blue said, given from God, the king can do anything he wants, including chop off your head and starve you, right?
Yeah.
And that version of blue ran Europe for over 1,000 years. And I think it looks just like Putin's blue. It's a very thin veneer of rules that applied to the lower classes in forms of control. But whoever was on top, the guy with the biggest sword, right? Or nowadays, the guy with the biggest...
it was a very blue-red thing. And if you listen
Yes,
to
precisely. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
It looks very much, yeah,
Yeah.
I think it looks very much like Putin.
Yeah.
I'm agreeing with you on that. Very, it's just a thin overlay of red. And then you're right, lots of purple tribalism underneath there.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that's happened in the West, and even worse in the US, is fostering that tribalism by all of this identity politics, right? Where all of a sudden, all the dissatisfied purple is coming up, and there's no we anymore, because the we is so small that it can't live in a modern society.
Yeah. Thanks, Barbara. Vadim, please.
I would like to hear your comments on the subject of the very quick change in the value systems that we're observing. You mentioned Putin as younger version of Putin who had a pretty significant orange element.
Mm.
And
Well,
as Putin was aging, as his relationships with the world has changed, as his health probably has changed, I see a lot of commentary that says that he has really moved down the spiral.
Yeah.
On the other side, we see Ukraine, who in 2014 was much less opposed to Putin. And it was not just a Russian-speaking. Well, the Russian language is a factor. You mentioned that, but that also the support for Putin was much more significant in other parts of Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And again, I hear a lot of commentary that the value systems and the identity of Ukrainian people has significantly changed over the last 8 years. And that is being shown in the conflict as it goes on today. And that moves to the next thought in the same line. I was watching a very interesting dialogue between Garry Kasparov, the chess player turned emigre politician, and Alexei Arestovich, who is responsible for public relations and propaganda in the Ukrainian government. Mm-hmm. We're probably using the same sources. It was fascinating in terms of people seeing this crisis as something that can give rise to as a pretty significant jump in the development, evolution of various systems, structures in Europe. So how would you comment on that? On the evolution of the potentiality of evolution that is existing in this time?
Oh, that's a hard question, Vadim. Thanks. I think we have to realize that value systems in the society don't necessarily change so quickly, but events can surface them or not. So, in my view, that and that's why, if you look at Ukraine as a country, and we can say that about many countries, you can see that the orange values are dominating now, and I think. But also for people driven by blue values, the democracy can be very attractive. Doesn't necessarily mean you're driven by blue values, you're against democracy, as long as it brings stability and all these other things. So I think that what I see, I'm not sure if that's an answer to your question, Vadim, then let me know. But is that it's just there's all these values there, and then whatever happens in these geopolitics, certain things come up. And they get space, So, I'm not, like in the Soviet Union, you could say that the blue values collapsed when it came to the governmental system, but that didn't mean that a lot of people driven by blue value systems all of a sudden weren't driven by blue value systems anymore. I don't know exactly what the values profile of the Russian people is. I'm sure there's a lot of blue values there, a lot of religion and so on, right? It's just that the political structure doesn't allow that, it doesn't give space to that at the moment. And so these changes in regime, in values, can be much quicker than the underlying dynamics. And I think it will take decades for Ukraine to develop more and more orange values. And a lot of Eastern European countries, or even interesting thing is, we think about, we talk about this, and if I talk about the Netherlands, if I look at the dominant power, currently it's orange, deep orange, some green has a lot of influence. If we actually do, the only country I know where we actually have surveys of values of people based on the outcome of elections. And our estimate with that is that the biggest value system in the Netherlands is still blue. They're not dominant, that's not 50%, but there are more people driven by blue values in the Netherlands than with orange values. The green value system in the Netherlands, we estimate about 15% at the moment, while the world sees us as a green haven, right? But the 15% is more powerful than the bigger blue portion, or it has relatively more power.
Well, my question was mostly actually more oriented towards possible changes in Western Europe. You mentioned that there is a need for proper response to the events in Ukraine, that you need to recognize red as red and respond to red in the language that red understands. Yeah. And that's basically a yellow type of response. That was something that you would expect from that.
Yeah.
And the question is do you think it's something that can actually move the Western Europe also in the direction of maybe a little bit accelerated development, maybe not?
Well, that's a great question. So from a position of hope, yes, I hope so. Because we've, especially in the Netherlands, we've been struggling with this dominant orange and not even green values, and it's like it's frustrating, And of course, we're doing well, This is the thing, one of the change conditions. We don't talk about change conditions here, but one of the change conditions for change is to have enough dissonance. The Netherlands doesn't have enough dissonance to get out of its comfort zone, and it seems like the Western Europe at the moment doesn't have enough dissonance to really grasp the reality of the situation. You'd hope so. I don't really see that happen. But I do hope that, I don't think that all of a sudden people start to think yellow, but I think what can happen is that an event like this can start a different dialogue that at least invites a little bit of yellow into politics, enough to, one of the positive signs is that even green parties like in Germany are now pro armament, which they weren't before. The other side of it is that we see a lot of the naivety, let's just talk and maybe give Putin a little bit, and I think that's just even how to say, on a short term that could maybe save a few people's life. On the long term, I don't think it will at all, because it will just create the next conflict. I'm not necessarily an optimistic person when it comes to values development. So I hope it will happen. I have no clue if it will. It's the other thing, of course, is that the thing that could happen is, because this other thing that hanging above our head is climate change. The Netherlands is for 40-50% below sea level. We won't exist in 100 years or 200 years. And one of the things that this could initiate in Europe is a much bigger call for renewable energy and stop using fossil fuels and so on. But it's happening, but it's not a major force yet. Until I see it happen as a major force, I won't believe it will happen. Paul, please.
I guess I ultimately have a question about asking you for some further thoughts on how to introduce yellow dialogue into this kind of a thing. But I'll set it up by saying, kind of what I see, how I'm interpreting what's going on with the whole Ukrainian conflict situation is that, on the one side, I think you really laid it out very well. You've got the red nuclear threat, or the willingness of a highly red dictator who is the supreme leader of a very red, blue, purple society to do whatever he wants to do. And that includes, he could mobilize 1 million reservists and just like in World War I, send them over he could kill 1 million young Russians just to, move the battle lines a mile. And you've got on the other side of that, so you've got that red on one side, you've got the green, and this is I would say this is a weakness of the green V meme, is it does have an extreme aversion to the use of force, extreme aversion. And I agree with you. I don't know how you can meet strong red aggression with anything other than modified red aggression. I just don't know how to do it. And then the middle of this is you've got the strong orange Western values, which are all about material success. And ultimately it's about how do you minimize risk. And so you're kind of in this, we're going to play this, try to play both ends against the middle here so we can maximize our profits. And I don't know any other way other than to try to introduce yellow integral concepts into that.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
I have to think of what Don said, no more rewards for predicting the rain, only for building the arcs, and when I was presenting this and sort of putting Don's picture there, I was thinking about it and I thought, I can do an analysis here, but I don't have a solution in the sense that, I can see what the leaders need to do, but I have no solution as to how to get those leaders to see that. And the other thing is, I realize that the decisions that our leaders need to make are a lot more complex than I'm presenting here as well. There's a lot more complexity in that as well, right? That's a good thing. And so there is, we in the Netherlands, since 15 years, we've been trying to sort of influence politics with Spiral, and I don't think we've done a good job with that. I don't really have a clear answer on that. Unfortunately, it's the only thing we can hope is that the life conditions will force, that these are enough life conditions to force our politicians into that. And I see some signs of it, but I see also signs of still complacency. So it will be very critical what Western leaders, what will develop in the next, what will develop in the next months and so on. And I want to say one thing about the force. It's like, something to our green hearts. Let me put it that way. Because I think that Spiral does invite us to really connect to people who they are. And to me, we have to do that to Putin as well. It doesn't mean that we give him what he wants, but that we really understand where he comes from. And I think this, what I've presented is the best that I know of what he comes from. Doesn't mean that, he is also a result of his circumstances. And it's actually quite logical the way we got where he is. And love can say no, so even though we connect to him, we understand him, and we know where he comes from, we can say, no, this is not what you want, because your desires, your needs are crossing the boundaries of what we want. Marshall Rosenberg used to have this term called self-empathy. I spent some time with him. He's a great guy, and he was really capable of connecting to all sorts of people. He would say, I'm still working on Hitler. But he was really capable of making this this heart connection to people without agreeing with what they did, but just understanding why they would do it, because that's the first. If there's a dialogue possible, that's what you want. But he also had this concept called self-empathy. It's like if you're in this dynamic with a person and you notice that that your boundaries are being crossed, you also need to take care of yourself first. And I think that's also what we need to do here. Is the self-empathy for us, or for if we include Ukrainians as being us, people that want to live in freedom, we don't sacrifice them to Russia's needs. Sorry, Russia. I mean, we understand that you're afraid of democracy, Putin, but you're not getting that part. We'll happily talk to you about any other way, right? But I wish I had an answer to your question, Paul, because then I'll be working on that.
I think we all are, and I think maybe part of what our role is to be patiently waiting for changes that we can respond to without knowing the answers fully yet.
There's this term that Adizes uses, copy, right? It's about the collusions of authority, power, and influence. So the thing with spiral dynamics is it's an X-ray or it's a MRI scan. And it tells us what's going on. And if we are the surgeon, we can work with that. But if we're not the surgeon, there's nothing. There's often not so much we can do with that, other than than taking our position into the democratic process, right? And as I've seen, when spiral dynamics became really popular in the Netherlands in the 2005, 2006, 2007, we had all these you could say green idealistic ideas about that, but very little of that has actually materialized, because we didn't have the copy, we didn't have the ability to influence politics, and politics had so much red in it that we basically weren't able to get into that.
Thank you,
Barbara.
It also occurs to me that we think in the original model that blue should be controlling red, right? That's one of its sort of, but historically, when orange wasn't as unhealthy as it is now, I mean, orange is in pretty bad shape. I think Saeed is probably understating how bad things have become in the orange world. But when orange is healthy, it just reaches out a paw and bats down toxic red, because it blue bats down red because it's contrary to whatever truth blue's going. Orange bats down toxic red because it doesn't allow stable commerce. It doesn't allow, and if we could perhaps, I sometimes wonder if there's got to be 100 orange people in the world who aren't monsters, right? Surely there are. Probably not more than that. But maybe we need to also catalyze that group to sort of gently put out the word to their sick orange friends that, hey, you just can't keep arming nutcase dictators around the world because it makes you money.
Yeah.
And maybe you ought to think again about the consequences of this.
Yeah. It makes you think of another thing, Barbara, and that is that if we look at the shift in Europe since the Second World War, in the Second World War, we were fighting for our orange freedom, but there was enough red and blue underneath to do that. And I think the shift has been to a more orange-greeny type of naive orange, besides all the problems that we've talked about. And I think it just needs to include the whole stack again. And I think that's also what you're pointing at. Right? So, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure how we make that stack healthy anymore. One of the problems with life conditions is, I can remember Don saying to me a couple of times, Claire used to say people double down on their mistakes instead of growing, right? And then he said, but I'm thinking that they're triple and quadrupling down on doing the same thing over again.
Yeah.
Another thing I think that Green sometimes misses, Don used to love the quote from Claire that people have a right to be where they are, and forget the second one, which was, and they sure don't have a right to act out from that level. So just the way you don't let your 2-year-old bang on his baby sister, right? Again, maturity would say we also don't let sick red dictators bang on the world.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I don't have exactly I had a question, but I think you answered it already. But I just sort of wanted to echo or to voice this, my whole process, my whole evolution in looking at the conflict in Russia and Ukraine, because I've felt that it's somehow extremely significant for evolution somehow. Although perhaps all humans think that whatever conflict is happening at the moment is significant, but it's just that it's such an important critical juncture now with our use of energy and our relationship with the planet. And of course, those of us that believe that it's possible to evolve into something better that functions better with this planet, that now is the time to do it. And we think, oh man, this is just like the worst thing that could happen right now. This is taking us backwards. But the other side of the coin is that sometimes you need certain things to be exposed. You need the system to be exposed. Like probably very few people thought about the gas lines that were running from Russia to Europe. Nobody thought about that much. It's just things work and you don't question it, because that's orange complacency. As long as things work, you don't question it. But sometimes we need that conflict and that pressure for the life conditions to be right, as you were saying, to hopefully make that change. It doesn't mean we will. We could continue to be complacent. But I've started to think that perhaps, I mean, not that this is a good thing, it's definitely not a good thing, but that it could serve a purpose by forcing us to look at certain things.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. It could be one of the triggers that also helps us to, to develop enough yellow thinking to also deal with issues like climate change. But I have to realize that we're just talking about Europe here, right? I mean, China is a whole different player in this thing on the world scale, which needs to be included into these solutions we need for the world as well, which is a whole other story about what's possible there.
Right.
Thanks a lot to Auke. Again, I followed with a lot of interest. My interest is in democracy a lot, and where I'm working with people in democratic organizations or administrations. You said that there is a lot of unhealthy orange in Europe, and Putin knows that and uses it. And I wonder, because you didn't mention anything of the manipulation forces that sometimes pretty clearly go back to Russian roots. That doesn't matter, US elections, even European. I've worked in the European Union, and we know how weak things sometimes are as a floating between US interests and Russian interests, basically, depending a bit where the member state is. So did you not mention that because it's so implicit to unhealthy orange? Or would you also think there is a mix of red trying to abuse democratic systems using influence with social media to get to results that you actually want? So how free are the elections? I don't think they are completely free because of the level of maturity of so many citizens who don't really reflect and analyze. So they're being maybe manipulated. And there could be a bit of an acupuncture point that when we educate our young people and our environment to really examine what is happening, and then you make really responsibility of the voting power and not letting oneself be so manipulated. What is your stand on that? It would be interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, good point. Well, I mean, I think first of all, there is, of course, with the social media, I mean, it's clear that Russia has used social media to wage an information war, and that's been going on for like more than 10 years. And of course the U.S. Election of Trump. We don't know if Trump would have won without it or not. We don't know how much influence they have. I think we probably never know. But the fact that it's clear that Russia tried. The same thing with Brexit. Is clearly influenced by Russian interest but also directly. If you look at I talked about the populism, and many of these populist groups, they're actually financed by Russia. Almost openly. Baudet, which is one of the Dutch, most fascist type of politicians, he rose to power when we had a referendum where he wanted people to vote against having this agreement with Ukraine, and it was directly financed by Putin. So there's the influence is certainly there, and I think we have to make a distinction. So, and then of course, if I look at the electoral system in the US or the UK, it's just not fair. You don't have a fair representation of votes in parliament. Like I think in the Netherlands, at least we have that. It's not always the best choice, but anyway, it feels at least to be more democratic. So yeah, I mean, that's another area in the West we need to address. But I think it's really good to realize in the context of this conversation around Ukraine is that we have in Russia, there is absolutely no democratic system. It's totally fake. So even though our system is not perfect and it's influenced, and I think a lot of us feel disempowered because the money and politics are much close together. I still prefer it because I can still at least put myself up to be voted without being poisoned or killed or whatever, And so I really want to make that distinction as well. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot there to repair, and I think Russia has probably more influence on that than we think.
Your presentation so much. I'm on the West Coast, so I have to be really prioritized in my time to get here. So I wanted to say that I love this. My mind got 60% smarter, but I went on the internet and I searched everywhere and I cannot find any books by you. And I'm so confused because why have you not written a book yet? And what can we do to help you with that? Okay.
Well, implant some writing genes in my I'm just not much of a writer, so I do a lot with spiral dynamics, mainly in organizations, but also in social projects. I'm a doer. Unfortunately, I'm not a writer. So sorry.
Auke is a great teacher and a mentor.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's great.
Maybe and the other thing is I've seen friends around me struggle so much writing a book. and the thing is that today I love to prepare this presentation because it was for me also very I really also love to sort of put this whole story together because I think that needs to be told, and I had a great motivation to do that. I don't have that motivation to write a book. So,
yeah. But I quickly,
Veronica, do we officially close out this session? So
Rasa gets the last word.
Yes, please, Rasa.
I just, I will not get into, details, but I just really, really wanted to thank you, Auke. I think this was the one presentation where, because I am from Eastern Europe, right? So it does seem about right. Nothing triggered me. It was nothing that would say, okay, no, this is nonsense. It cannot be like that. So I really hope, it's a little bit tiring to get into all these fights on Facebook, in debate. Anyway, it's really hard and tiring. So I really just hope that people will get to see this presentation and sort of get deeper into the situation and to walk away from this, that there's one bad guy here and it's US. Anyway, so I just hope that it will bring much more clarity.
Good.
So thank you, Auke, really a lot.
Yeah, thank you so much. We all appreciate it.
Good.
So thank you and goodbye, everybody. Have a wonderful day or evening, wherever you are. Take care.